Okay, so if you're tracking global power shifts, and honestly, if you're preparing for the UPSC exams, you really should be, there's a big development you need on your radar.
What's that?
The UK is sending a major naval force out to the Indo-Pacific. We're going to do a deep dive into this deployment of the HMS Prince of Wales carrier strike group.
Ah, yes, that's definitely significant. And you're looking at the Eurasian Times report on this, I gather.
Exactly, that's our main source today. It's got some really interesting details. So this isn't just a casual visit, right?
Not at all. The HMS Prince of Wales is set to leave Portsmouth around April 22nd, and it's leading quite a formidable group.
Yeah, the report lists it out. You've got the carrier itself, obviously, then a Type 45 destroyer.
Yep.
That's for air defense, primarily.
Correct. Think of it as the anti-aircraft shield. Then there's a Type 23 frigate, more focused on anti-submarine warfare.
Okay, so anti-air, anti-sub, what else?
A Tide-class tanker for fuel, a submarine, though they don't specify which class usually, and an aviation support ship. Plus, crucially, exactly, 2 full squadrons of F-35B Lightning jets, plus helicopters. It's a serious air wing.
It definitely echoes that 2021 deployment with the HMS Queen Elizabeth, doesn't it? That was a big deal the first time those F-35s were operationally deployed out there by the UK.
It really was. And the stated purpose this time around. Officially, it's a deterrence mission.
Aimed at China, presumably.
That's the stated context, yes.
Hmm.
But, how Beijing sees it is, a bit different.
Right, the Eurasian Times piece highlights this. Chinese media acknowledge the U.S. Navy's constant presence, sure, but they seem to be painting this British move as the U.K. trying to carve out a greater role for itself.
Which sets up an interesting tension right from the start. It's not just about the ships, but the messaging and perception, too.
Definitely. And that perception battle really heats up when you look at the reaction to that British media report. Was it The Telegraph?
Yes, the Telegraph. They published a piece that, well, certainly didn't pull any punches.
No kidding. They claim the HMS Prince of Wales has a huge advantage over China's current carriers, the Liaoning and the Shandong.
They even suggested it could, and I quote, deal with both at the same time in an open ocean fight, which is quite a statement.
A very bold statement. So what was their logic? How did they figure that?
It really boiled down to the aircraft. The argument was all about the Royal Navy's 5th-generation F-35Bs versus the Chinese J-15s.
Which are essentially adapted land-based jets, right? Not purpose-built carrier fighters from the ground up in the same way.
Exactly. The Telegraph argued that in a deep blue water conflict, the F-35 stealth sensors, that whole 5th-gen package, gives it a decisive edge over the J-15.
They did mention the future, though. China's new carrier, the Fujian.
They did, acknowledging that things will be very different once the Fujian is fully operational, likely with newer aircraft. But for now, they stress this present disadvantage for China.
And wasn't there something about the submarine escort, too? An Astute-class sub.
Yes, that was another key part of their argument. The Astute is a very capable nuclear attack submarine. The Telegraph implied that China's anti-submarine warfare, or ASW, capabilities might struggle against it.
Sort of suggesting the sub could pose a major threat to Chinese ships, potentially undetected?
That was the implication, yeah.
Yeah.
A hidden danger beneath the waves, complicating things for the Chinese surface fleet.
Okay, so that's the British perspective, or at least the Telegraph's take. How did the Chinese media push back on that?
Well, interestingly, they sort of focused on the same core point, the huge generation gap in fighter jets, but used it to explain why the British felt so confident.
Ah, so acknowledging the tech difference, but maybe implying it's not the whole story.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Or maybe suggesting that British confidence stems only from that single factor, potentially ignoring others like, say, numbers or home field advantage in their near seas.
It's fascinating how the same facts get framed, and we should probably mention the Eurasian Times itself adds a note of caution here, doesn't it?
They do. They explicitly state they don't endorse these kinds of sweeping comparisons, emphasizing just how complex carrier versus carrier engagements actually are.
Good point. Real combat is never like a stats comparison on paper. Plus, China isn't standing still. They're working on their own stealth carrier jet, the J-35.
Right. That will eventually level the playing field somewhat when it gets deployed on their carriers. This whole picture is very dynamic.
And speaking of Chinese carriers, they've been pretty active recently, haven't they? Using them for, well, showing the flag.
Absolutely. Power projection is a major role. We've seen the Shandong carrier group conducting drills near Taiwan recently, which always raises concerns.
And missions further south, too. Philippines, South China Sea.
Yes. operating in those contested waters. Japan regularly tracks and reports sorties from the Shandong when it's active in the region. They're definitely making their presence felt.
Which brings up a really sensitive question for this UK deployment. Will the Prince of Wales sail through the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea?
That's the big unknown. The Eurasian Times notes there's no confirmation, but they do speculate that a transit through the Taiwan Strait in particular would likely trigger a fiery response from Beijing.
Understandable, given the politics around Taiwan. It's such a flashpoint.
And even if they avoid the strait, just operating these large carrier groups takes up a huge amount of sea and airspace. The potential for encounters, even unintentional ones, is always there.
Good point. Now, what about the timing? Some Chinese media suggested this UK deployment was linked to the U.S. moving the USS Carl Vinson, didn't they?
They did note the timing, yeah. The Vinson was redeployed to the Middle East. But the Eurasian Times understanding is that this UK operation, Highmast, was planned long before that.
So not necessarily a direct backfill for the U.S. carrier?
Apparently not.
Oh.
It seems more part of a longer-term UK strategy. And it fits a pattern, too. The report mentions the recent French deployment, Clemenceau 25, which also pushed into the Indo-Pacific.
Right, the Charles de Gaulle carrier visiting the Philippines and Japan for the first time. So it feels like more European powers are looking east.
It certainly seems that way, seeking a more central role, as the report puts it. And this UK deployment, Operation Highmast, is definitely ambitious in scope.
How ambitious are we talking?
Well, it's described as a 12-nation force involved overall.
12 nations. Wow. Who's contributing?
Canada and Spain are sending ships. Norway's providing warship. And then there's support mentioned from France, Italy, Spain again, Sweden, Denmark.
That's quite the coalition. And the personnel numbers.
Around 5,000 people involved in total. That breaks down roughly into 900 British Army, 2,500 Royal Navy, and about 600 from the Royal Air Force, plus personnel from partner nations, presumably.
So, yeah, definitely the UK's biggest deployment of this type since the Queen Elizabeth went out in 2021.
And the itinerary is packed. It's an 8-month operation.
8 months? Where are they going?
Starts off in the Mediterranean, participating in a NATO exercise called Neptune Strike 25-1.
Okay, NATO first, then.
Through the Suez Canal into the Indian Ocean. There, they've got drills planned with India, the U.S., and Singapore.
Covering key partners there. What's next?
Moving further east, around June 2025, military engagements with Indonesia and Malaysia are scheduled. Then a port call in Darwin, Australia.
And Australia means exercise Talisman Sabre, right?
Exactly. That's a huge one. Hosted by Australia and the U.S., involves New Zealand, and something like 16 other countries participate these days.
Busy summer for the strike group, then. Where to after that?
Operations planned in South Korea, focusing on things like ship interdiction, possibly related to enforcing UN sanctions against North Korea.
Interesting. And any more major stops?
A significant one expected in late August, docking in Tokyo Bay for the Tokyo defense engagement. That highlights the diplomatic side, too.
Right. It's not just military exercises. So, Tokyo in August. When do they head home?
The plan is for a return to the UK around December 2025. They'll come back via India and the Suez Canal again. All told, about 227 days at sea.
That's a massive undertaking, a real demonstration of capability and commitment to the region.
Absolutely. And just to circle back, still no word on that potential Taiwan Strait transit, but the potential reaction remains a key factor to watch.
Okay, so wrapping this up, especially for our listeners focused on UPSC prep, what are the big takeaways here?
Well, first, you've got a major Western naval power, the UK, making a very visible long-term deployment to the Indo-Pacific a critical geopolitical hotspot.
Second, there's this whole debate around capabilities, the F-35 versus older jets, the submarine threat, which highlights the complexities of modern naval power. Don't just take headlines at face value.
Third, it's a multinational effort.
Yeah.
12 nations involved. This shows how alliances and partnerships are playing out in the region.
And fourth, the sheer scale and duration, 8 months, multiple exercises across the Med, Indian Ocean, Pacific, signifies a serious strategic focus.
Yeah.
Understanding these power projections, the diplomatic signals, the military aspects, it's all crucial for current affairs.
Definitely relevant for both mains and maybe even prelims, depending on how specific questions get.
So, a question for you, the listener, to think about. Looking at all this, the deployment, the regional tensions, the capability debates, what do you think the real impact of this British presence will be on stability and power dynamics in the Indo-Pacific?
It's worth pondering. There are arguments both ways.
Indeed. If you found this deep dive useful for getting your head around this complex issue, especially for your UPSC current affairs, please hit that like button, subscribe for more analysis.
And definitely drop a comment if you have questions or your own perspective on this deployment.
We sourced today's discussion primarily from the Eurasian Times.
And we'll be back soon to unpack another key global development.
Stay tuned, and thanks for listening.